Morning, everyone. On behalf of the American Geographical Society Council, our members, and the staff, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this third Location Tech Task Force Blue Ribbon Panel, National Security Perspectives on Location Surveillance and the Future of Democracy. To those of you participating in the conversation on WebEx and those that are watching on live stream on Facebook, it's great to have you join us this morning. We are proud to partner our EthicalGEO initiative with the Henry Luce Foundation to investigate the societal implications of geospatial technology and location tracking. Mobile location-based applications have become ubiquitous in our society. As all of you know, they've changed the way we live our lives in a very short period of time. There are, however, problematic and unanticipated effects of using this technology. To better understand the ethical implications of its use, we have provided this platform to frame the discussion and to address these issues as they are already impacting our lives on a daily basis. COVID-19 has put a spotlight on the concept of using mobile tracing and surveillance to fight the pandemic. Around the world, the utilization of this technology to fight the coronavirus is being employed to various degrees, and already governments and people worldwide are faced with the issue of compromised privacy and what that means as we go forward. Over the past couple of weeks, our first two Blue Ribbon panels met and looked at the ethical implications of mobile location technology and the impact on vulnerable publics from an international perspective and from the unique American experience. And the conversations were extremely insightful. We also had the opportunity to hear from Ambassador Samantha Power when our president, Dr. Marie Price, and Ambassador Power had a conversation about the human rights aspect of the use of mobile technology. Today, we turn our focus towards national security and the overall well-being of our country. And we are very fortunate to have panelists who led our efforts in national security for many years. Over the next couple of months, we will continue to convene Blue Ribbon panels and leadership spotlights and collect testimony from other perspectives to serve as the basis of information and data that policymakers can use to help guide us into the future. Before we move on, I'd like to explain to those of you on our WebEx platform the best way to get the most out of today's panel. For those viewing on desktop computers or laptops, we recommend you customize your viewing by hovering over the mouse in the top right of your screen and selecting the icon in the middle. During our Q&A session later, to ask a question, hover your mouse under the arrow and click on the question mark icon in the gray bar at the bottom of your screen. To those of you using a tablet or mobile device, select the icon with the three dots, which will then allow you to select the question mark icon to submit your questions to our panelists. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Christopher Tucker, the chairman of AGS and our moderator for today's session. Chris, it's a pleasure to welcome you and your panel.
Thank you, John, and thanks to the team for organizing this event for us today. When we first were approached by the Henry Luce Foundation about exploring the ethical implications of mobile location tech in the midst of COVID-19 with an eye toward the future, we immediately thought it would be important to convene national security leaders who hail from a community that has a lot of experience with the use of location technologies for surveillance and collection, because we are entering an era where biosurveillance was going to be the coin of the realm. Much has changed since we began in April, and I think this set of national security leaders are going to be even more relevant, and their thoughts even more provocative as we explore the national security kind of dimensions of the current situation we're in. But I think it's important to appreciate that those who have served as leaders in the national security community here in the United States not only have expertise in understanding how these types of activities go on, but also how to protect Americans' rights while engaging in these surveillance activities. So while the nature of the threat, this being COVID-19, may be different from the threats that they've worked on over the course of their career, we think that their perspectives are going to be useful and very interesting. So I'd like to start by introducing our panelists. I'm going to introduce everybody and then pass on to each for their comments, 7 to 10 minutes of comments before we go to Q&A. So I'll begin with Mr. Robert Cardillo, who currently is president of the Cardillo Group, but Robert became before that, his many years of government service, Robert was the 6th director of National Geospatial Intelligence Agency in 2014. Prior to that, prior to leading NGA, he served as the first deputy director for national intelligence for intelligence integration, and prior to that, served as the first civilian J2 on the Joint Staff at the Pentagon, head of intelligence. So I think a lot of firsts there. Mr. Cardillo began his career as an imagery analyst with the Defense Intelligence Agency in 1983. When NGA came about, he served in many leadership roles, including the head of analysis and production, the head of source operations and management. His leadership assignments at NGA are wide and varied, including congressional affairs, public affairs, corporate relations. And currently, as I said, Robert is president of the Cardillo Group. Next is Honorable Susan Gordon. Sue recently served as Principal Deputy Director of National Intelligence, and before that as Deputy Director of National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. Sue served 27 years at the Central Intelligence Agency with positions including Director of the Information Operations Center and Senior Cyber Advisor to the Director of the CIA. She is known for a commitment to diversity and inclusion, championing the recruitment and retention of diverse workforce, and expanding geospatial intelligence services to the open marketplace. Mr. Chris Inglis served over 41 years in federal service in the Department of Defense, including 28 years at the National Security Agency and over 7 years as its deputy director. Mr. Inglis began his career at NSA as a computer scientist within the National Computer Security Center, followed by tours in information assurance, policy, time-sensitive operations, and signals intelligence organizations. His military career included 9 years on active service with the U.S. Air Force and 21 years with the U.S. National Guard, with the Air National Guard. Last is Lieutenant General Vince Stewart, U.S. Marine Corps retired. General Stewart dedicated nearly 38 years to the U.S. Marine Corps. Most recently, Lieutenant General Stewart served as Deputy Commander of United States Cyber Command. He previously served as the 20th Director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, becoming the first African-American, Jamaican-American, and Marine to serve as the Director of DIA. His intelligence career has included overseeing global defense intelligence, the Global Defense Intelligence Enterprise, and policy surrounding defense intelligence, working under both President Obama and President Trump. So as you can see, you probably can't have a more qualified group. These are 4 of our nation's top national security leaders. Each have recently served at the highest levels of the U.S. national security community. And thank you so much for joining us today for this conversation. So we are going to begin with 7-10 minutes of prepared comments by each, and then kind of move into Q&A conversation mode. And Robert, if you're ready and comfortable, I see your mic is off. We'll pass it over to you to kick us off.
Thanks, Chris. It's trite to say, but it couldn't be more true. It's a real privilege to be here having this conversation, especially with such good colleagues and friends. So I'm really looking forward to the exchange. But let me, if it's okay, let me use my career as a way to provide a frame of reference for the conversation and what I think is for this moment of opportunity. So Chris, in that overly long introduction, I think you said I was an imagery analyst when I signed up, and it's not exactly true. I was an intelligence research specialist, Parent photographic interpreter, closed parent, GF7. And I say that because just to give you, no pun intended, a frame of reference about what this thing that we, now call geospatial intelligence and remote sensing, et cetera, was in the day. And in the day, it was a wholly owned government monopoly. And so if you happen to be a a very senior member in our government and you had a top secret clearance, you could ask a top secret question in which I or one of my colleagues might task a top secret satellite to get a top secret image, to write a top secret report. You get the idea, right? And it would go back, and by the way, it would go back to you in due time. Okay, so either the state of the technology or our workload or whatnot, but due time was not real time, let's put it that way. It was days, weeks, even months, depending on, again, the complexity and the time required. I am senior enough to remember the days in which I was working in the center of that exploitation analytic universe known as Building 213 in the Washington Navy Yard, a windowless building that sat on the corner of M and First Street in Southeast Washington. And you could feel a palpable buzz in the building because everyone knew that the buckets were arriving, which meant that a top secret satellite some weeks earlier had ejected film capsules out of the spacecraft that had been exposed to light through a film feed system traveling at 23,500 miles per hour around the Earth, resolving that image, canisterizing it, ejecting it, sending it back through the atmosphere, opening a parachute, having it caught by, I'm sure, one of Chris's planes with a trapeze on the back of it. And people say, no way. And I say, yes way. That's American ingenuity. You know, that's the way that we looked into denied space in those days, predominantly the Soviet Union. And I just give that at the beginning to say how different things are now, because this group, our audience, will certainly be aware of the near ubiquity of such sensing today and the many options we have with which to sense the planet, to understand our environment, to create better insight into issues with respect to health and security and immigration and now disease, pandemics. If I use that as one end of the bookends and go to the other now, I am now 15 months out of my federal service and interacting with what is a very vibrant community, which is taking all the innovation that I just described and applying it in ways that create, one might think, the commoditization or the commercialization of that service to support agriculture and petroleum discovery, protection, better understanding of environmental changes and conditions, et cetera, so that we could perhaps make better choices about the same. And I'm reminded too, given the topic of this discussion, or the title of our discussion here today, that, and I'll just paraphrase that some time ago, Justice Brandeis from the Supreme Court made the comment while having a discussion about the issue with respect to transparency and civil liberties, that sunlight is quite a good disinfectant for a democracy, meaning that transparency, openness, shared awareness can, and I know we'll talk about the other ends of this, but can be a way to bring people together, not to always the same endpoint. Obviously, we will see things differently. We will interpret them differently. We will project different futures based upon that. But if we could just raise the level of our common appreciation, I'll say, for facts, and I know that's a hard thing these days to understand what are facts, but if we can use this growing capability in a way that raises that level of shared, at least, awareness, perhaps we can move to that awareness becoming discussion, debate, potentially understanding on the other side. So to me, while these discussions are absolutely necessary because there is a risk and there are attendant consequences that are not positive that can come with said transparency and persistent surveillance, et cetera. There can be misuse of any technology. That remains true with this as well. But to me, the best way to combat that eventuality is to have these kinds of open discussions, preferably before the crisis, before the clash occurs, so that at least we can think through some best practices, procedures, et cetera, about how data will be used, how it will be accessed. So I'll finish with my note of optimism. Again, I believe strongly that at the end of the day, this move towards this global transparency is a good thing for liberal democracies. It's a good thing when citizens can share information, have the same shared understanding as their governments, and vice versa. This isn't to say there shouldn't be secrets and there doesn't need to be protected information, but in general, the more that it's shared, the better. It leads to more knowledge, more awareness, and ultimately, I think, to shared understanding. So I'll stop there, Chris, and then look forward to hear what my colleagues have to say, and then game on.
Great, thanks, Robert, for those opening remarks. It reminds me of some of the discussion in our previous Vulnerable Publics international panel, where there's some folks in some countries that lack fundamental access to these technologies. They don't have cell phones. And so in a way, our focus and discussion on the ethical implications of these technologies, in a way, they think of as a first world problem. Like we would love to have to suffer the ethical dilemmas of having those technologies because we'd also have the benefits of those technologies to begin with. So I think your kind of focus on this new global transparency is something we didn't used to have, and now it's something we do have, and there's great benefits with it. But yet there are these ethical implications. So I'm sure there's other societies that don't have access to this stuff that would like to get the global transparency, the data transparency first, and they're probably more than happy to have us ponder those ethical implications up front, so maybe they can benefit from our discussion. So thank you for that. So next, I think I'd move over to Sue, if Sue's ready to chat with us. Over to you, Sue.
I am. Thanks, Chris. Thanks for joining. Thanks for hosting, for AGS hosting this event. Robert, great comments. I have to change all mine because you stole half of them. Damn you. So I was talking to a colleague at Google probably 4 years ago now, trying to figure out how we could partner. And my opening salvo was, hey, we're in the same business. And my colleague at Google kind of looked quizzically. I said, we're in the business of using information for good. And I think that's an important construct for this conversation, because if we're going to talk about surveillance and intelligence, I think maybe I'll give a couple of comments on what I think it really is about. And I think there's some lessons that we can offer to how we take advantage of this moment. I think these are extraordinary times. I think there are immense challenges, but the world knows so much. And there is so much knowledge to be had that if we can harness it in a way that geospatial and location information is so good at, it puts things in context of time and space. I think we have some real potential to understand the challenges that we're facing in ways that have been elusive before. What I love about intelligence and national security and the things I've done for my career is it's a great purpose. And for my 30 to 40 years in the business, there were big questions, big uncertainties, big threats, big fears that we were trying to better understand. And we, as Robert said, first developed the capability, and now neatly that capability exists openly. But I think one of the ways that we can effectively harness what seems to be ubiquitously available and overcome some of the negative potential is if we think about the purposes that we can achieve with its use. And there are questions to be answered. I think COVID put those into effect. How do we see some of these big global interdependencies emerging before they are manifested in the individual's doorsteps? And I think that's exciting to think about. Intelligence is a couple things. Number one is it's inductive. It's about seeing what is and then going up to see if you can find the general rule. It isn't as much about proof or about looking to prove something to be true. It is rather about observing what is and moving upwards to see if you can understand it. I was a zoologist by trade, and one of the things we used to say is the cool thing about zoology is you assume every organism is doing what it's doing perfectly, because that's what evolution says. Your job is to figure out what it's doing. And in a weird sort of way, if you're studying what's going on in the world, that's a good way to look at it, because you are forced to deal with what is, not what you would prefer it to be. And if you can develop a craft around that, that allows you to deal with what you see, not jump to a conclusion about what any particular data set means, test that theory to see if you're right, you have the real chance to come away with an understanding that you didn't have before. And I think this notion of a world being sensed simultaneously and that information being available to us allows us to find some of these geographically distributed but temporally connected events that will give us a running start on some of the things that we need to be understand so that solutions can be found. Now, the important thing about intelligence is we think that it's about secrets or about data. Intelligence is really about craft. It's really about the craft of being able to deal with fundamentally uncertain information with some kind of certainty. And that has to do with confidence. Do you have confidence in what you're seeing? Do you have confidence in the information and the sources of information? Now, it's a little bit easier with location information because there's a certainty to it. But when you put activity on top of location, you've added that uncertainty back in. So what's the craft we're going to apply in order to be able to divine the understanding that will allow us to act? And so I think that's one of the things that our collective challenge is. I think there are some constraints that the intelligence community and the defense community has always worked under. I always say technology isn't the problem. It's the people who are employing the technology and whether they are constrained by the rule of law or they're not constrained by the rule of law. It isn't that the technology itself is good or bad, it's the people who are putting it into play. So the question is, what rule of law is going to govern? In today's society, so much is being developed commercially that we're trying to apply rules after the technology has been introduced. And so maybe it's not just rule of law governed by statute, maybe it's a little bit about the ethic of use and who is the one to determine that. But I will say that as we look at these technologies and we look at location surveillance, I think the most important thing to me is that we not escalate government authority. It is really easy to do in crisis. If you think about post 9/11, I think that was one of the real tensions is we didn't want to escalate the authority. And so I think that's an important piece. How do you keep the governmental authority at the same level while still allowing you to find new things? I end with one last thought. I think there are some choices that we can make technologically that will allow us to use data more effectively. One is think about use, not just about the collectors or the information itself and how it's supposed. If we want to take advantage of this world, we got to have data that can work together. And so we ought to think about that when we are building systems or software that are producing data. And then the second is, I worry a lot during COVID that there's a huge difference, as Chris mentioned, between the haves and the have-nots, the cities and the urban areas. I spent some of my COVID time in Amarillo, Texas. I got to tell you, Amarillo's experience with COVID was a whole lot different than in the big cities. A lot more impact. And we're not looking at all the trends globally in the served and underserved populations. And I think this is a time that we can look across that and do it. So I'm there. Just remember, there's a craft to this. There's a craft that allows you to not jump to conclusion. There are rules that need to govern it, but this is an exciting time to think about how we can use this data to find answers and insights to things that we can't readily see. That's it.
Great. Thank you, Sue. You gave us a whole lot of threads to pull in our conversation. I would like to highlight, your comments toward the end on haves and have-nots, the served and underserved. We actually began this dialogue, as I said earlier, by convening 2 panels on vulnerable publics. And as you kind of say, different geography matters, right? Different folks are vulnerable in different ways in different geographies for a bunch of different reasons. So when we had the Vulnerable Publics International panel, it was a lot of discussion around migrant worker communities from South Asia that were in the Middle East under precarious work visas, and what happens if they get sick, and how is mobile location tech being used to track them and deny them mobility and access, et cetera. But yet when we talked about the US experience is about Black Lives Matter and indigenous lives and kind of the migrant communities under ICE enforcement and ICE using Palantir, and, boom, like the discussions get very geography specific. And I think within the United States, Amarillo versus New York City, I think, is another great example of, geography really mattering, and the geospatial data, the location data, probably having very different ethical implications in its use. So I'd look forward to pulling those threads with you. So next, I think we have Chris Inglis. Chris, if you feel ready, yep, we'll pass the mic over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. And, thank you for this venue. It's an important discussion. And like Robert and Sue, I'm humbled to be in the company of the other 3 panelists. I'm particularly humbled across my career by the realization that intelligence and national security professionals are much better at secrets than they are at mysteries. We traffic easily and well in secrets, and probably could turn up more than a few that would titillate. But I think what we're actually struggling with in this discussion is a mystery of how do you align these personal interests, the pursuit of collective security, the pursuit of public safety. And I think the good news, the bad news is that every generation within this liberal democracy has struggled with the same. It might the speed, the scope of the technology that has been brought to bear, the degree to which that can integrate, the degree to which that can hold at risk, especially personal security, is perhaps overwhelming us. But we're still trying to achieve the reconciliation, the alignment of those in the way that we did at the birth of this republic. And I'm happy, but I should be honest enough to say that all of my remarks are necessarily biased by having come of age and living in a liberal democracy. And I think that the way a liberal democracy addresses these issues is different than other forms of government. There are legal distinctions between persons and agencies, particularly when those agencies carry governmental power. So we need to distinguish between what power has been granted to the government, what power or perhaps freedoms have been granted to private sector organizations. And as their means increasingly intersect, we need to remember to distinguish between their purposes. Ultimately, the government needs to understand, ask itself on a frequent basis, if not an incessant basis, what is the purpose of power? Our own liberal democracy characterizes that in the preamble of the Constitution, but then double taps that in the 10th Amendment, which says that power granted to government organizations in the pursuit of public safety or the collective defense is necessarily constrained. Constrained by what the Europeans, our European friends, would say is necessity and proportionality. There needs to be some purpose, some legitimate purpose for which you've aggregated the power whether that's invested in the form of technology or your ability to roam into personal interest. There needs to be a necessity, and it needs to be that you're using that with the proportionality appropriate for the situation. I think, as Robert indicated, we need to be quite transparent about how we align these interests, and I would use that word as opposed to trade these interests. We need to do it upfront. We need to do it with some degree of transparency, if not absolute. And we need to actually try to work all of those from the start, as opposed to have a bias or a favorite in mind, and then we try to reconcile that to the interest on the back end. If in fact you want to support and deliver privacy, if you want to deliver personal security, if you want to deliver public safety, if you want to deliver collective security, you have to have all those parties at the table on day one, as opposed you bring them in when you've got a solution that you want to perhaps run through the mill. It's always too late. And I would say that ultimately the solutions we're looking for, while it might be that technology kind of brought us this generation's version of the problems, those solutions are almost certainly going to be based upon values first, and they're going to be a mix of technology, controls, and accountability. And we need to think about all three of those dimensions when we say that I think we've got an iteration of this, however fragile that might be, that will work for this time, for this place, for as long as perhaps that fragile coalition can hold firm. With those opening remarks in hand, I turn it back to you. But thanks very much for the venue.
Thanks, Chris. Wow, again, a lot of threads to pull. I think, going back to some of the previous panels that we had, I know it's, I don't know, not to make anyone uncomfortable, but, we actually had a group calling for the abolishment of ICE that monitors the use of tech by ICE. And it came down to their concern over fundamental issues of accountability, right? Kind of as you said, it's their concern wasn't the technology itself, or necessarily the ends, but the fundamental accountability and can they depend on it. So I think the issue of bringing all the different stakeholders together, all the communities, folks with different overlapping values, and somehow creating an accountability regime over this mobile location tech data, which kind of betrays the most kind of intimate moments of our lives, right? It's every place we go. It's, who we talk to, who we were sitting with late at night, how we behave, how to achieve accountability over the use of that data when we know that there are important uses like biosurveillance to help in the collective security. So thanks for those. And I think this will be fruitful lead to a fruitful conversation. General Stewart, if you're ready, I'll pass the mic over to you.
If I can figure out how to unmute my mic, we'll go. So the benefit, I think, of being last on a panel with some of these incredible icons of our community is that they generally covered everything. And so all I need to do is say good morning and I stand by, but I'll make something up because I've completely changed my remarks since, as Sue said, Robert took half of hers, she took the other half of mine, and Chris took the rest. So let me try to pitch it a little bit differently from the perspective of the Director of Defense Intelligence Agency. So what we were tasked to do is to look at our adversaries and potential adversaries and really spend a good bit of time looking at their military capabilities, how far, how fast, how high, how it's sustained, et cetera, leveraging all of the capabilities to bring insights to our policymakers and decision makers. So now I've got a new adversary. Go back to the old adversary, military capabilities, covering down on Russia, China, North Korea, India, Pakistan, covering the globe, leveraging geospatial intelligence in many ways to do this. And today I can go online and buy imagery. I can buy high resolution imagery, which I would have loved to have had as a tank commander, a platoon commander, a battalion commander. And now I can go in, plug in my account information, and I can buy imagery. I can access imagery from the array of cameras and devices that are out there on in modern society. You go to any large city and some not so large city, and you're under surveillance the moment you step in the streets, from cameras online, in the stores, et cetera, et cetera. If you somehow miss those, almost everyone in a modern society has a camera on their phone or on their watch or on some other device that now is giving me incredible insights of what is going on around the world. So you take all that now, and I've got a new adversary, an adversary called a pandemic, and of any sort, any virus that's originating somewhere around the world. How does the community get insights as to what's happening globally, how it might be weaponized, how it might be utilized, and then balance the public health safety issues with the privacy issues? So now I've got this incredible amount of collection capability that can tip and cue things for me so I can gain insights. I'm now drifting a little bit away from the military capability, which is a whole other issue. But I'm being held responsible for seeing the weaponization of a virus that could impact us in our warfighting capability. So spread thin, lots of issues, lots of data, lots of insights that can be gathered to help understand what is unfolding. Very, very different adversary that we're used to seeing. And now probably the greatest challenge is I now have access to data on US persons wherever they might be, whether they're in Dubai or they're in Chicago. I'm tracking them in near real time. I'm understanding their health issues. I'm understanding who they're associating with, and all that tremendous implications for what it means in terms of protecting privacy on US persons. But from a collection standpoint, what a great opportunity on a global standpoint for tipping and cueing and getting other insights that we need for our collective defense. So for me, the big issue again is how do I segregate those US persons' data so that I'm not impinging on the privacy, security, health issues of US persons, but how do I leverage that tremendous collection capability that can give me insights on what our potential adversaries might be cooking up? And oh, by the way, on the US persons side, much of the data is resident on systems that are unsecured. So what does that mean from a counterintelligence standpoint? The other big aspect of what I worry about. As much as I can collect and as much as I can use it for tipping and cueing and for gaining insights, so can our adversaries. So as we're collecting all this data, HIPAA data, health record data, about the person's temperature during the course of a period of time is now available to our adversaries, and all of that data gets our adversaries the insights that they also need to understand our vulnerabilities and where they can take advantage of our system. So I will stop there, I think. And one last thought. As we surge to deal with COVID-19, and we put in place things that will help us to track, to isolate, to manage this pandemic, and I think everybody on both sides would say that this is the important battle. How do we make sure, and I don't remember who said this, how do we make sure that we don't, that we can roll back some of this intrusive collection after COVID-19? We tend not to back away from any of the cool stuff that we get from collection effort. And so how do we make sure that once we get this pandemic under control, we figured out a way to protect US person data, we figured out a way to move that securely, and we're not abusing the insights that we gained from that collection effort. I'll stop there.
Thank you, General Stewart. Your last point trumped your previous point in my overview. You know, when we got this started, our partner at the Henry Luce Foundation was very focused on kind of the second and third order effects of the things that we put in place, recognizing that, at least in America, when we come up with technology solutions and we implement, organizations, bureaucracies around them to use those technologies to accomplish a mission, we tend to be not that great at unwinding that mission later on. And oftentimes we grab that capability off the shelf and apply it to the next challenge without necessarily thinking through the ethical implications of its reuse. So I think your point is spot on to kind of the inspiration of this effort. And then your other point around the kind of ubiquitous commercial availability, I think several of our panelists talked about that. Not just satellite imagery, but with this mobile location data, there's an open marketplace of it. There's a kind of this gray market of location data that is sold for one purpose, but it's through American ingenuity. You can repurpose it for a lot of other purposes that were not part of its original intent. So again, those unintended consequences of mobile location tech in an era of COVID-19 poses a lot of challenges. So I'd love to start pulling some threads. All of you, for the audience, we prepared a set of kind of Q&A so there's no gotchas here. Everybody kind of knows that these questions are out there before we open up to the larger audience. But one of the reasons we wanted to bring you all together here is because the national security community has a very distinct experience with putting controls on surveillance capabilities, right? And I think Chris gave a great opening set of remarks on that, and even quoted the 10th Amendment to us, which I think puts things in stark relief when you can point specifically to the Constitution. But so surveillance as a military intelligence concept assumes certain set of legal authorities, a certain notion of the adversary, and a clear idea of whose liberties are being protected. In our case, right, we want to protect Americans' liberties and those of our allies. So when similar techniques are applied to biosurveillance, how do these concepts change? Chris, I don't know if you feel prepared to kick us off on that, but it seemed you tickled us with some of the earlier comments that seemed barking up that tree.
Yeah, so I think recent memory informs that we were challenged 911 forward with trying to work an issue, terrorism, counterterrorism, that seemed to ruthlessly, relentlessly cross our borders. But even then, all the difficult decisions that we had to make about how to use a very complex array of authorities, domestic authorities, foreign national authorities, military authorities, we were still able to find boundaries that would create seams between the application of those authorities. There still was a distinction between an actor that was based or vested in a foreign terrorist organization. We still had a distinction between foreign terrorist and domestic terrorism. And while sometimes they would cross those seams in ways that vexed us, we were able to kind of keep things straight, keep the alignment in ways that made us comfortable, because geography was still on side, and the technologies we would apply could still discriminate between the legal distinctions that attend to jurisdiction or geography. COVID-19's thrown all that out the window, right? The virus knows nothing about geography. It only knows about its host. And so identity has become the new frontier, has become the new boundary. And for us to then preserve those legal distinctions, which are still important, we need to kind of understand what perhaps that new boundary is, that new identity is, and be humble, about the collection of data that will at once scoop up all of the innocence, because those collection methods know nothing about boundaries that used to help us, that used to keep us safe. There's a term in the background material, dragnet surveillance, which always makes the hair on the back of my neck go up. And I think that dragnet surveillance immediately conjures up the idea that we're collecting all data for all purposes. And therefore, I abhor the term. Right? You might collect a lot of data, but you need to know what the purpose is up front. You need to know what the discrimination is, either in your technology or your query or your accountability, your controls, such that you can make legal distinctions, which are not simply law, but ethics, right? And the compact between governments and their citizens. And we're going to have to work harder to figure out how to deliver all those things. It may be that we achieve that segregation, not simply based upon some verticals, right? Some geographic boundaries, but perhaps on the basis of granularity. It's okay for us to know something about the aggregate kind of characteristics of a population, but in order for us to then penetrate the veil and go down and understand something about a particular person or their location or their activities, we'll need to make sure that we have the legal justification for that. And so we need to think not just in terms of horizontal boundaries, kind of jurisdictional based boundaries, but vertical boundaries, right? And if that's harder, so be it. That's what it means to live in a liberal democracy. Just some opening thoughts.
Great.
Hey, Chris, can I jump in?
Yeah, please do.
Yeah, I don't, wouldn't want to nor need to amend or edit anything that Chris Inglis just said. I love the laydown, especially the one about, you know, that long-term compact between the governed and the government. And we have always had thus conversation because that's the form we chose, that we give certain authorities to those that we put in charge to secure the liberties that caused us to create that government to begin with. And so it's always going to be a give and take. What I would suggest, and happy to be, get into a debate about this. You can't open up the web today or the, online without seeing a new article about, the changes, and there are many, the myriad that have been brought to the fore through our experience with COVID-19. I'll just say too, I'm not a big fan of new normal. Seems too normal. Because I think the changes are greater, but to me, it's more of an acceleration than a change. I think we're just now moving faster, even faster, into this digital domain. You introduced the bio domain, of course, through COVID. And to me, it creates a sense of urgency. We have less time now to have the conversations, the thoughtful conversations that Chris discussed about, the governed and the government. And thus, we're here online and we're going to be engaged with the community in some way about, where people think the lines are. I would just commend us to Sue's phrase, be purposeful, but move, this bio world is going to accelerate whether we vote to or not, whether we, figure it out or not. And as difficult as COVID-19 experience has been, and everyone knows how difficult it's been, imagine this experience that we're having right now, and it was a purposeful instigator. Someone, something, some entity created the harm to our society purposefully. So we're not just home because we all need to be safe and figure out how to recover, go back to work. We're at home because, and we're in conflict. It's 9/11 and we don't know what to do about going forward. I did the Cardillian thing of not answering your question, Chris, just kind of spread it a little further. You're welcome.
So I can't even remember what your question was. But I do have a couple comments just riffing off the two. Number one is there is no longing for a simpler time, right? We're not putting the genie back in the bottle. Most of what's being created is not being created by governments. So the notion that the government is going to somehow resolve this is going to be a hard thing to do. The private sector and the people that are creating it have got to buck up and put some ethic around the things that they're doing. We are going to have to recognize that there is a difference between data and truth, right? There will be lots of data points that we will have. That doesn't mean, the reason I was talking about the craft of intelligence is there will need to be a craft around the use of this data, regardless of who is going to be. And then how long does it stay? My COVID example is my father was diagnosed with COVID on the 1st of May. He was in isolation until the 23rd of July, because our standard is you have to have 2 negative tests. Well, that's crap. And that's no longer the CDC standard, but it's just moving too fast. But there is data out there that I'm going to have to fight for the rest of my life. And this is just an explosive problem of the difference between data and truth, and how long are data valid, and how many interpretations of that data get to be made before it gets challenged. But we're going to have to solve all of them. And part of it's going to have to be the people that are producing it, and part of it is going to be the people that are giving it away in order to be able to get there. This isn't just a government issue.
If I can jump on something that Robert said, one of the real challenges for me, 9/11 was a pretty impactful event that lasted a few days. We kind of saw the attacks. We kind of knew where it came from. We could go over there and fight them there. And just to tie in Chris's comment, this virus is moving in, after we recovered from 9/11, about 30 days later, we were back to playing baseball. I don't remember the exact timeline, but we were back to playing baseball. We're getting back to normal. People are getting back in the air. Here's an infectious disease that has slowly killed 148,000 Americans. We don't understand it. We are not sure how to treat it. We're not sure the long-term implications. There's so many unknowns. It's like 9/11 in slow motion. And as we're doing this, we're collecting so much information about a whole host of things that, again, comes back to how do you secure that data? How do you make sure that data is properly utilized? How do you make sure that it informs the right level of policy making and decision making? And it is just such a different environment. And again, I bristle at the same idea, this Dragnet approach, because someone will misuse that data. And we just got to think our way through from a policy standpoint. How do we protect, ensure the privacy while still fighting this slow motion battle against a pandemic?
Great comments. Unless somebody else wants to add to that, I'd kind of like to just pull us along to a different but related question, actually skipping down to kind of the third one on my list. We're struggling with COVID-19, kind of as Sue said, around, data and truth. One manifestation of that is, in the testing regime, we don't know who the enemy, we don't know where the enemy is because testing is difficult to get. And when you do get it, there's false negatives and false positives. And, if you get a positive, you don't know if it's false or not. So you end up, that shapes all of your behavior after that. How does the defense intelligence community, maybe historically, when you're deploying surveillance capabilities, think about things like false negatives, false positives, certainty and uncertainty, acceptable risks, right? Because we are kind of giving people information about themselves, and then in a place where we are really doing contact tracing, we're actually physically tracking them and saying that person has it, that person doesn't have it. I'm going to treat this person differently. And there's big ethical implications of that, particularly if you have like a 30% error rate in your testing. I don't know, are those concepts something you grapple with over the course of your career? And are there any lessons that maybe we can, take from that as we deal with COVID-19? I see a lot of smiles. Who wants to take the bait?
Oh, I'll say something, and then the rest of you all can stall and correct it. So there probably are some lessons there to learn. One is how we break down assessments. And that's your confidence in the information, your confidence in the source of the information. And that leads you to, there are sometimes you get information that is credible but not corroborated.
Hmm.
And you deal with that differently. That goes to your notion of risk. You need to warn on it, but you can't act on it in the same way that if it is credible and it's corroborated, and then you have a different set of things. So I think one of the things we have to do is break it down into source of the information, confidence in the information, and then actions that you can take depending on each one. You've got a little bit of a problem here because the science is just so new that we don't have much. We have another problem in that right now it's much more of a fear than a threat. Right? And fear is something that is just kind of hanging over your head. It isn't defined enough for you to take action. You know it's problematic. And so a lot of the work of intelligence is to be able to translate a fear into a threat, and that is define it more and more. In this case, in COVID, I think science will help us do that, but we're still so new that fear is really hard to deal with. In the intelligence world, biological warfare has always been almost in the fear category because it was just so hard to nail down in order to be able to know how to do. So I think there are some lessons there in terms of parsing it into how you know what you know about each element, and then coming up with some rubrics that allow you to talk about it so you can make decisions about where you can take risk and where you can't. And then that last piece of risk is it risk that the free world will end, or is it risk that you're going to have a diplomatic kerfuffle, or is it risk that there will be the same sort of rubric with COVID? So I think there are ways to break it down, and that's what I mean by we need to put a craft around this rather than just reacting against each data point as though it means the end of the free world. All right,
Yeah.
now fix it, guys.
Yeah, well, I mean, I really like those words, credible but not corroborated. You may have a credible, concern that you were exposed to COVID or that your community, but it's not corroborated until there's testing, and then the testing's a bit uncertain. And so, warning, there needs to be a structure of warnings, but maybe not particular actions or tiers of actions. And
the last thing I would say is that's where in intelligence cross-domain is really important. So you can get data in one area, geospatial, and it will tell you a lot of things, but man, it's a really great day when you have human source to be able to tell whether those two things align. I think about it in terms of self-driving cars or what's going on with computer vision. That is, we're trying to resolve the whole truth thing just within the image. And in fact, can that image exist in that place and time? Is another way to find it. So I think the other thing we can look at is for some cross-domain corroboration that will help us sort it out.
All right. Robert.
So thanks, Sue. Nicely done. Give me enough time. Craft, though, I like it. I mean, I think it is the right way to think through this, because even though I had a lot of analytical titles late in my career, it's been a long time since I was an analyst. And Sue's right that we were welcomed into a profession that by definition existed in ambiguity. If it wasn't ambiguous, it wasn't on our desk or wasn't on the list. So as one of our heroes, Mike Hayden, likes to say, if it was easy, it wasn't ours. Okay, if it was black and white, we didn't get to do those. We got to do the fun, really, really difficult ones. And so as I think through your question, Chris, about AI, range of performance, positive, negative, accuracy, et cetera. Okay, I deal with inputs all the time that have variants of credibility and pedigree and assuredness and reliability. And I put those into my craft. And so I think Sue's exactly right, that this is where our craft can be as contributory as any product or outcome we may offer. And so, and let's face it, when in my view is intelligence really got its credit or lack thereof at point of decision around that uncertainty bar. So it's a good day when we could just reduce uncertainty or limit it in a way that helps that decision maker make one better decision, take one better action, think one more strategic thought. And then we go back and do it again. That just gets you set up for the next piece. And so to me, it is that, that way of thinking, that structured way to deal with ambiguity, to deal with noise in the system, to deal with false flags, whether they're purposeful or not, and to process those in a way to reduce uncertainty at point of decision. So I think that should be our contribution to this challenging part of the discussion.
Great, thanks, Robert. I think General Stewart was up, and then I saw Chris's hand. General
First of all, any of the analysts that tells you that they're anywhere close to 100% certainty probably ought to get checked out. That's hard to get to. But what Sue has talked about, and again, thanks Sue, give us all a little bit of time to think. For me, credibility of the source, multi-int approach increases certainty. But we also had a framework, and I think that's what maybe that's what Sue's getting at is she calls it a craft. But we had a framework in which we put all this reporting together that said this is the likely story. This is the likely intelligence that's brought credible sources, high degree of corroboration into a big picture that says, as a result, here it is. And then the risk portion becomes really on the user side. How will, because there are some users who will make decisions on 2 or 3 data points, and there's some users who will want 1,000 data points. So the challenge in this environment is, what is the framework that helps us to understand not only the virus, how the virus is moving, what it means to our citizens, how do we contain it, how do we get the right facts assembled in such a way that informs the right policies and right decision making. And currently there is not a framework or a set of crafts that allows us to really understand this environment and tee up the right insights for policymakers and decision makers. And I think that's where we are. So some of this is transferable, but the question is, how quickly can we do that and do it in an environment that's moving a lot faster than a couple of tanks moving across the battlefield.
Right. Thank you. Chris.
So I support and love all of those remarks. I'm just going to add the other end of this conversation, which is that all of the advice, counsel, insight that might be provided by the intelligence assets that we've described are received by someone or some set of someones, and they have to act on those. The American tradition of intelligence is that intelligence organizations almost always are excluded from actually kind of voting for or concurring in a particular policy. They inform that policy, they inform those choices. Most of us probably remember a time when doctors would tell us what we were going to do. Right? You walked into a doctor and the doctor would say, this is what I'm going to do because this is the best thing for you. We've moved away from that paternalistic kind of approach. And now what the doctor will say in a very vexing way is to say, here are your choices. There's some probabilities, some uncertainties, but you have to choose. That's actually quite healthy in an increasingly complicated world so that we know who's ultimately accountable for the choice, right? And it puts the person who's informing that choice in a position where they can be as impartial as possible, right? Where they can inform that choice, but they're not wedded or invested in a particular choice. I think we need to continue that discipline going forward and make sure that the conversation is very clear about the ambiguity. That sounds ironic, but very clear about the ambiguity. And that ultimately that ambiguity implicates the receiver, not just the sender.
great comment. Sorry, I was on mute. If there's no comebacks on that, I would like to actually dig in a little more on that Dragnet effect, Chris, that you referenced, because I think everybody wants to avoid that, right? Anybody in the business of collecting information in support of collective security, public health, et cetera, wants to avoid that. Citizens certainly want to avoid that. And that is part of that compact of the government and the governed. How can we build a capability that takes care of us or helps keep us safe, but yet, doesn't create, I'd say, a long tail of information that can, in an unanticipated way, suck you into legal processes. I think that's one a little bit different with, I guess you guys have experience in this, but a lot of the current concerns that have been voiced in previous panels is all of this data being collected and then it either collected commercially and then just sold off in the gray market for a purpose that it wasn't originally intended. And then you're caught up in some weird, public or private dragnet, or like literally a government collected data that is then used in prosecution for a completely different purpose than like the public health mission that it was originally collected for. And I mean, since the national security community has so much experience in this, can you kind of wrap a vocabulary around how we should think about it, how we should protect from it, and both lessons maybe for the public and the private sector? Chris, I know you just finished, but if you want to jump back on that.
Yeah, so I'll start. I'll kind of try to display some of Sue's courage, perhaps not as well. I'll go first. I think that I'll give partly a framing and then perhaps a little bit of personal experience with the American legal system. The framing, I would say, is that you need to start with all values in mind, meaning that this liberal democracy tries to deliver, as I indicated in my opening remarks, kind of attributes, properties, kind of a way of life for individuals, their pursuit of happiness in some sense that they can be secure in their possessions. And you can't put that off to the side when you begin to perhaps approach another great unbridled good of this society, which is public safety or the collective security. You need to put both of those before you and say that my purpose in pursuing one, because that's the authority that I've been granted, must be at the same time to protect and not do injury to another. And if you try to align those up front, you'll be better able to perhaps deliver those. In doing that, you need to, in your purposes, find the least intrusive method to kind of do that, least intrusive to the other kind of goods that are on the table, and to worry about effectiveness and efficiency. Ultimately, as I indicated, that's not just about technology. It's about the controls, kind of the accountability that kind of attends typically to protocol and procedure. Here's my experience. U.S. courts generally have cast aspersion, right, to those methods that are not wholly based upon technology, that aren't exhaustive in the kind of guarantee that you will touch only those things that you are intending to touch. Illustrative methods, the possibility that technology might surprise you, that the aggregation might have some unintended consequences, have very little support by the courts. But that's actually a good thing, but it then tees up the contest of how do I actually be as kind of exhaustive as possible in saying, this is what I intend to do, this is how I think it's going to play out in a very complicated environment, but at the same time find yourself not entirely trusted up front by a system that says I will ultimately determine the success based upon what you do as opposed to what you intend to do, right? Very difficult discussion, but it's one that kind of is difficult from the start through the middle and all the way to the end.
Chris, does anybody else want to pick this one up? I mean, it's a bit of a hot potato. I know Chris's experience at NSA certainly informs his comments. Sue, I see your mic is hot.
Yeah, I'm because my colleagues were so generous with me, I'm gonna go back around. What I love about our country is that our Constitution was really about limiting the role and limiting the powers of government. And I think that's awesome. I mean, it's really one of the remarkable things. and we've all touched on it. It's why we like transparency. It's why we talk about the rule of law that keeps people from doing, particularly in positions of power and in governmental positions, from being able to do whatever they want. I love Chris's point about intention. I think one of the reasons why we had to be so careful in intelligence is we are so intentional about wanting to keep people safe that you can lose sight of the unintended consequence of that intention. And so I think as we go forward, we don't want to lose that notion that the government is small, its powers should be limited, and when it takes on things for the common good, we have to have a framework by which we protect that intention from blooming beyond. But I also think that this is a conversation to have with the citizenry, because it's that deal you make between the two. If you want the government to be small, then you need to accept that it can't protect you from everything. And it can't ensure that nothing bad goes wrong. In other words, it's finding that great balance between those two. And I think the struggle that we have in a digital world where the world is now at everyone's fingertips is we kind of lost this notion that society is the willful subordination of individual interests to the common good. So maybe it takes a little bit of deciding what the common good is in terms of using this data. And then the acceptance is that there will be many things that will happen that have to be controlled differently below the level of the government. So maybe there's something between that tussle and this purposeful limitation of governmental power, which means that there is some risk that you assume and actions you need to take below that level.
Sue, anybody else? Not everybody has to answer every question, so it's not obligatory. If not, I think what is a complementary question, and it kind of gets into that dynamic nature, and it's number 6 on my list. But when new technologies are introduced, and y'all have been in the intelligence community long enough to see new technologies come along, when they're introduced, the national security community must adapt its tactics, techniques, and procedures, right? How you go about things evolves because of the nature of the tech, or the nature of the new collection. Also, it sometimes the community needs to reimagine the boundaries of its mission, including the risks and opportunities. Do you guys have any experiences? Maybe this is storytelling time, I'm not sure, but do you have any such experiences that might inform how we think about the introduction of new mobile location technology enabled biosurveillance methods, right? This is a moment in time. 15 years ago, this would not have been the same discussion around COVID-19. We didn't have GPS in every smartphone, attached to every human, regardless of how young or how old they are. Not every human, right? There is actually some folks that are overlooked because they don't have access to the technologies. But like new things have evolved in the real world. And I think you guys have a lot of experience with a mission space that's dynamic and evolving because new technologies have been inserted to deal with new challenges, and you had to build that new craft. How does one build the new craft? What is the process by which one builds those new TTPs? Is that a big, crazy question? I think Robert wants to bite. There you go, Robert.
No, I was just going to answer that last question. Yes, it is, Chris. A big, crazy question. So.
Thanks.
No, but let me go down this path just for a little bit. I'm not sure it's tremendously interesting to your audience, but let me just say that, I talked about those long ago days when I was an analyst, and largely speaking, I was an analyst in an analog age. I talked about the film buckets and the hard copy, and I didn't mention light tables, but we shone light through these glass tables up to a microscope and peered into the dark regions of the Soviet steppes, you know, et cetera. And so, but that was, you know, the level of technology that existed. And one thing that I experienced, Chris, was a certain aversion to introduction of new tech. One, for a good reason, which is, well, how do I know it does what you say it does, Mr. Scientist in a white lab coat, you know, et cetera? How do I, you know how to think about its potential error, et cetera? You know, I mean, so that's good. That's our craft, and, you know, that's due diligence. But the other one, especially this, I think this existed predominantly in the imagery world, although Chris may have had a similar experience in natural language processing, is wait a minute, that tool does that really, really well. I used to do that really well. And so what are you gonna do with me? You know? And so there's that human reaction about, you know, relevance and job security and all that. And so what I told my teammates at NGA is, I get it that you've either had some bad experience with early tech and too wide a range of errors and false positives, et cetera. It is indeed getting better because of all the reasons Sue said. It's happening commercially, and it's getting better because, you know, the only measurement there is people use it, buy it, invest in it, et cetera, or not. And so that's our capitalist system at its best. But two, I want you to use that tech to lift the human dimension to a higher level, meaning let the tech do what the tech's really good at. Counting tanks, identifying new features, measuring elevation, et cetera, et cetera. I used to have to use humans to do that. I can now put my humans on top of that new baseline and think deeper, look farther, see threats sooner, all of the things that I really want them to do. So a little different angle than you posed the question, Chris, but I'll say that my sense, I mean, I left government a year and a half ago. My sense, though, is that the community, broadly speaking, is in a much better place because of the personal experience, you know, with online financial transactions and, you know, purchasing of commodities through the web and delivery of services to our door. I think it's having a positive carryover effect. I know some in the audience might worry about how far we take it, right? Point of discussion here. What are the limits of that technology? What level of government access, you know, is there to the data? I mean, I have conversations with colleagues, not saying that's any of these on today's panel, but, you know, where they say, well, look, you know, Americans love to give up their location to Amazon. You know, why do they do that so easily and, you know, not the government? And I said, well, government's got the power of arrest and taxation and detention and all those kinds of things. And so I do think they're different animals. I do think there is a way to lift our analysts on top of that tech in a way that can provide value.
You're muted, Chris.
As easy as it looks. Chris, I saw your hand up a little earlier.
Yeah, so I'm just going to offer support all of that, but I was going to offer that ultimately the ability of a governmental organization, and I'll give an NSA example, to effectively assert its mission to the American people is based not just upon literal professional competency. Can it technically and with the expertise it has literally do what it says it's going to do? But it's also based to an equal, if not greater degree, upon sustaining the trust of the people served. And you need to think about both of those as you begin to kind of align yourself up to accomplish some new mission. Many on this call may recall that at some point in the past, NSA collect telephone metadata. And the purpose of that, I think now we can talk about that at some length, was to detect what we called the crossing of the seam, to determine if we knew about a foreign terrorist organization, was it in fact in communication with and across the United States? And so could you detect one number kind of that you knew was associated with a foreign terrorist organization connected to a number in the United States? Because the people who designed that program were concerned about its potential impact on personal privacy, they went to great lengths to not collect content, to not collect geolocation, to not collect identity information. They just wanted to know about the crossing of the seam, and therefore were quite proud, right, that this had been set up to align those kind of great abiding dual goods within the American experience. But not having shared that with the American public, not having shared that broadly even within the legislature, people were left to imagine when they discovered that the collection of this metadata had been taking place, they imagined the worst possible kind of use of this data, and therefore went to the darkest possible corner. NSA, of course, for at least some period of time, lost the trust of the American people, not because of what it had literally done, but because it hadn't actually tried to build that trust through transparency and some declaration of, this is what I'm trying to do, this is how I'm going to do it, and this then is how I'm going to be held accountable to do that and that alone. Now, there are a lot of good reasons in the kind of the pre-2013 period where NSA would have said, but I can't share that with the American people as richly as I might like because the terrorists are listening. You have to always kind of try to figure out whether or not that's a real risk or an imagined risk. Well, they're still going to communicate. I think looking back over our shoulder, we think that that tool still would have had some utility. But because we lost the confidence, the trust, the kind of connection between the American people and NSA, it was a fairly rough patch for NSA from 2013 forward. And there's another advantage if you consult and if you're transparent early on, you get more heads on the problem. It might well be that somebody who you consulted with outside of the usual and sundry experts could have suggested a different way to detect the crossing of the seam. And while you were delivering perhaps a better understood solution, you might have had a better solution. Right? And so I would just say up front, when you're stepping into some new problem, complicated problem, you think you've got all the expertise in your silo, your stovepipe to deliver that. Think not just about literal professional competence, but about the extension of trust, particularly for a government organization, and about getting more heads on the problem. Those things will always kind of tell you that there's perhaps a greater period of consultation required in order to imagine, to set up, and to deliver a particular solution.
Sounds like wise advice for those taking the $500 million that Congress gave for contact tracing and setting up a new system right now. It's not just the expertise, but the process by which you build trust.
And it's the question somebody's going to ask in 2022, not the questions they're asking at the moment.
Right. Great. Does anybody else want to chime in on that? Otherwise, I'll move to, okay, General Stewart.
So I guess the question is, should we adapt, should we adjust our TTPs based on technology, and are we? And just to build on Robert's point, yes, we should adapt. Yes, we should adjust. The question is, all change is viewed as disruptive, whether they're organizational changes or capability changes. In many cases, you have a workforce that is very comfortable and sometimes threatened by those changes and what it means for them in terms of job security in the future. And so you have some inherent resistance to the changes. We've been getting it done and we can continue to get it done. But when I started this business, I could probably read all the things I needed to read and get through in order to get some analytic assessment, whether it's just a straight intelligence summary or something more profound than that. I can't do that today. I can't read everything. So I want my analysts to get out of the librarian function and get into the thinking function based on the insights that's drawn from all this data. And quite frankly, some analysts are hesitant to do that. They're comfortable with their routine. They're comfortable with their framework. And so it becomes challenging. The second part of this problem is that in many cases, our analysts don't know what technology exists out there. So we're writing requirements based on what we know, not what we're capable of doing. So the key part here is how do you get that partnership that allows our analysts to think about what they need, interact with the private sector to get the capabilities that exist out there, and marry the capabilities with the requirements with, and what I like to do is put a cross-functional team together on some of these tough analytic problems, headed up by one naysayer and one geek who's forward-leaning. Put a rope around their necks and say you survive together by leveraging the capabilities and solution, or you die together because you don't want to work as part of this cross-functional team. So getting the old dudes, and I hate to use that phrase, the folks who are hesitant to embrace technology with the folks who are progressive and early adopters in the same room with the same problem set becomes really key going forward. And I found that to be very useful in the past.
Great. Thanks for that. Anybody else want to chime in on this, or should I move on to next? All right. So I've got two last questions before I open up to the audience Q&A, and that's going to be a whole nother thing. And they're both around information sharing in a way, one domestically and one internationally. And I think I want to start with the domestic one first. Post 9/11, with the IRTPA, the law that reorganized the intelligence community, we created the ODNI information sharing environment, right? And it was the premise that part of our the reason 9/11 happened is because of a lack of information sharing. And one of the challenges there was not just sharing within the intelligence community, but sharing also with law enforcement, with state, local, tribal, the entire network of folks in the United States that have eyes on the ground that are paying attention to the threats that we face. And now that we're facing COVID-19, like that army of individuals is spread to our public health services, our hospitals, folks that are typically thought of as I'll call them social service providers, not law enforcement. And but yet the technologies we have, the authorities we have, the laws that are on the book for sharing a lot of information are kind of, I'd say, colored by a previous era. So, now that we are, trying to integrate everybody and everything, and we're trying to face this more amorphous threat that isn't like a person, that can be traced and targeted, but a disease that is kind of visibly but invisibly challenging us. What are lessons that you've learned through the intelligence community and information sharing, or maybe in retrospect, lessons that we didn't learn soon enough in the intelligence community that we might be able to apply to information sharing to protect, those the dual principles that Chris talked about earlier? Sue, I see your mic's. You're already hot. You're chomping at the bit. So
I am. So first thing is, I think when the threat surface changes, and when the decision makers about security change, you have to think differently about those with whom you share information. So if you think about Cold War days, governments had the information, governments were the actors. We shared information with governments and policymakers and the military, and that was about it. Then 9/11 happened, and we learned how to share information with state and local. We learned how to share information with people and nations that we didn't have a big trust relationship because we were in the same space. If you think about today, a digitally connected world has made the private sector and the citizenry part of the threat surface. And they've also made those people part of the decision makers about national and global security. So you want the people who are both threatened and who are deciding to have the best information they can. So I talk to my colleagues in the intelligence community all the time. Our job isn't secrecy. Our job is national security. If it changes, we got to change. That said, when we shared information with smaller more insular, more common groups. Everyone in that group understood the limitations of the information we were sharing. They understood the rules around its use. And so in order to be able to be more expansive in sharing information, we're going to have to do two things. One, if it's the government who's sharing information, we've got to think differently about how we share it and how it's going to be used, because we're used to producing it for a pretty small, pretty arcane group. We've learned a lot of this in the cybersecurity world, and Chris can talk about it. We've learned a lot about what we were comfortable sharing, and then we learned a lot about what needed to be shared. And so that has to happen. And then the second is we've really got to increase the understanding of the limitations of some information, kind of what I was saying before. There is useful information, but not all of it is true. Not all of it is perfect. And so there's going to have to be much more of a conversation with the people who are both threatened and deciding in order to do it, but we're going to have to expand, both internationally and domestically.
Thanks, Sue. Robert's mic is hot, so I'll go Robert, then Chris. Is that okay? Go ahead, Robert.
Completely agree with Sue's laydown. Let me give you an experience I had in dealing with a biological event as the director of NGA. So it's 2014, it's the fall. The world is dealing with the reality scourge of a different pandemic around Ebola, and much more deadly disease if contracted, but thankfully much more difficult to spread than the COVID experience we're having now. But in that case, President Obama declared it to be a national security imperative, and he directed that the 101st Airborne deploy to the hot zone at the time in Liberia in West Africa to apply one of the, to apply the secret sauce of the military, which is logistics, and to bring the capability to our healthcare community, global as it was, Doctors Without Borders being central to the fight there, with, they were called Ebola treatment units, ETUs, had to be set up around the country. And the reason NGA was supportive was, one, because of the president's declaration, two, because of the deployment of the military and we're a combat support agency, and three, because geography always matters. But when you're trying to provide treatment and diagnosis in a country, talk about the have-nots that don't have established lines of communication and effective connectivity, et cetera, you've got to go where they are. And at a time when the discriminator was time between diagnosis and treatment, because first step was diagnosing. And if you didn't have Ebola, we wanted you out quickly. If you did, we wanted you in quickly, right? And then two, if we had you in, then treatment had to begin. So isolation and treatment. And again, hours mattered, and so lives mattered. So that was, to me, great synergy between what we did, what the military did with logistics, and then what the medical community did. Let me just say, though, Chris, I have mused and talked with some colleagues about, we have the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. That's the full title of the organization's name. And, I'm not here to say one thing or another about, what they did or didn't do, but I would offer that had they had better locational science, didn't say geospatial intelligence, locational science, they could have done a better job of controlling, if not preventing, disease. I am not suggesting that NGA, for example, should become a provider to the CDC. I mean, that's a solution, but it's not one that I would recommend. What I would recommend is NGA take its craft and transfer it to those that can apply it in a way that's meaningful to Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And I think that's a necessary outcome of the crisis we're going through and the collective failure that we're experiencing. But I would contrast that solution with the one, well, actually, I think it's supportive. So when we went through Katrina, again, another crisis, different time, FEMA not prepared to do its job. NGA literally deployed at the time to support it. in a way that it had to. But today, FEMA does that itself because it was transferred. So anyway, I would argue that in this sphere, in the medical sphere, we need to move the craft, we need to transition the craft and have it applied by them, not the intelligence community, to do their mission.
Great. Thanks, Chris.
I'm just going to offer, typically, I'm going to aggregate this into 3 boxes, but it's a continuum, of course. Typically, when human beings are faced with a common problem, they arrange or organize themselves to solve that problem in one of three fashions, right? And they pretend that all of those kind of are some form of collaboration. The first of those is deconfliction, right? You know, that relies on serendipity. If I bump into you in the middle of the night, we'll kind of figure out how we came to collide. We'll pick each other up, dust each other off we go. But I'm not going to offer you any inside services or assistance until such time as we're on a collision course. The second, which is the much more insidious one, is the division of effort. We imagine that, you know, I can defend my patch, you can defend your patch. And if I find something in my stovepipe that I think you should know something about, then I'll go through the procedures to either sanitize it if it's classified, or kind of perhaps deproprietarize it. You know, I'll kind of take it down from my proprietary level to something I can push across at the lowest possible level. That kind of strategy depends upon a well-behaved adversary that's not going to run ruthlessly across your kind of imagined boundary, and that it's not going to leave a shard in your basement and a shred or hunch in the other basement that, absent putting those together at the lowest possible level, will leave you bereft of any understanding or insight as to what the adversary is doing. But the only real form of a genuine collaboration is where you share at the lowest possible level and without preconditions, where you develop a professional intimacy that says, before you ask me a question about some particular event, I'm just going to give you some insight as I see the world using the methods, the means that I kind of have at my disposal, so that I will pleasantly surprise you on occasion, that I know the other half of the thing you're struggling with, even before I know that you would perhaps have asked me the wrong question, or you have failed to perhaps kind of understand the power of what I can bring to bear. Having said that, right, if you lower those boundaries too much, you run the risk of mixing authorities and perhaps coming up with unintended consequences. But if you do that as a matter of co-discovery, if you do that as a matter of, I'm just going to give you insights into what I see in the world in unclassified, non-proprietary ways, you can then fire, right, some insights across your otherwise stovepipe boundaries, and you can collaborate all the more as you realize that you've got your hands on the same tiger. One might have the ear, the other might have the tail. But we do too little of that. We do too little in the form of that collaboration. I'll just close with an anecdote from my NSA experience. I wasn't there, but I'm told that this happened in 1940. When the Brits and the Americans got together in a place called Bletchley Park, each side was told not to tell the other side anything until the other side spoke first. That's what we know as the American game of go fish. Right? And you have to be perfect in your insight about what the other side might give up. You have to ask that question perfectly, otherwise you're not going to get the card you want out of the other player's hand. History records that they ruthlessly ignored those instructions they shared without precondition, and that gave birth to what we now know as the special relationship between the US and the UK intelligence systems, which share without preconditions using a high common denominator of the shared values of those two societies. And it's the envy of the world in terms of the exchanges that occur, because one side can pleasantly surprise the other without even knowing that they're about to. I think that that's how we need to approach COVID-19 in terms of private-public partnerships.
That's great. Thank you. Does anybody else want to chime in on this before I move to the international question? So, you know, the other great experience that I think we can learn from the national security community is how we've interacted with our partners abroad. Typically, we use the term liaison service in the intelligence community, because we know that, you know, while we may have collection on the ground to understand what's going on in a certain region, one of our partners is closer to it, may have better language skills, better understanding of the geography, better social network from which they can collect information. With COVID-19 being a international pandemic, but also a transnational pandemic, right? It's continuously moving across borders. We're depending upon our partner countries to have a level of insight as to what's going on there, even down to fairly granular, who's been tested, who isn't tested. And there's discussion around things like health passporting. We've had passports. You guys are familiar with, how we and our partners use passports to, I guess, mitigate transnational threats. But now the threat isn't so much the person as the disease that the person may be unwittingly plagued by. Probably misuse of the term plague, sorry there. But do you see lessons in the national security community's work with liaison partners, how we structure those relationships, how we do information sharing there, or maybe not? Not everything has to be a teachable moment. That we might be able to apply to any nascent health passporting system that we put together on the international scene to help us signal to each other and share information that may stop this particular threat. Maybe an obtuse question, but Robert took the bait, so I'll go to Robert first.
Sure, obtuse. That's what I specialize in. I get it, Chris, that there's a polarizing debate. We're polarized, right? So why wouldn't there be a polarized debate? But that there are, and obviously there's a middle case here, which one could thoughtfully take. But you see the shouts on the left and the right, and I mean that purposefully, that COVID, the experience of COVID is data point, exhibit, evidence of the necessity of our international community. That globalization was the right answer, is the right answer, must be the right answer for everything you just described about sharing of information and corporate and collective consequence and mutual approaches, etc. And I get it that there's a debate or a voice on the other side that says, this shows you the risks they're in. And we got ourselves so darn connected, right, that we got ourselves exposed. That exposure led to vulnerability, and now we're suffering. So it's time to pull back in, right? Time to get our supply chains back within the border, and put CFIUS out of business and all that stuff. And I mean, it doesn't really matter where I ascribe myself there, but I guess my point is, Chris, I'm going to choose. I think of myself as a person of hope. To me, this isn't, say a sentence, Cardillo, must be our future. That is to say that, to me, it explains the necessity for the recognition of our connected planet, and that the decisions made by any of us have an effect that go beyond our border. I mean, it's been a while since I filled one out because they're all electronic now, but you remember when you used to do the questions on the, return to U.S. immigration form? And I think number 8 always was, were you on a farm? Were you traipsing around on a farm? And usually, no, I mean, maybe, but, well, I think it's mad cow. I think that's where that came from. So, okay. Then I should tell you if I was traipsing around on a farm, because there's a real risk to my neighbors if I bring back, that disease. And I mean, obviously the scale of this pandemic is enormously different. But to me, the logic, and again, that exhibits my bias, the logic of that exposing and offering and providing that information says, yeah, I'm in the global community, and I agree to give up a few things in order to have the whole be better. So there, obtuse response.
There you go. I appreciate that. Sue, I see your mic.
Yeah, I think I can, thanks, Robert. I think I can say just a couple things. I think there are some lessons in the national security community. Over the course of my career, what has been lovely about the international security community, right, is that it kind of rides on a level of truth. That's a funny word. That's predicated on what Chris said before, and that is we are advisors, not the policymakers. That has allowed us over time, over years, to be able to talk with our colleagues internationally, independent of the policies that are in effect, so that everyone had the benefit of a common understanding of what our collective view of the facts on the ground were. I was watching Dr. Fauci navigate his tenure and his role, and I was thinking we ought to make him an honorary intelligence officer, because a lot of what he faces is a lot of what intelligence is that is we tell you the best of what we have. There's an uncertainty to it. We're sometimes right, sometimes wrong, but there is a foundation of truth that allows you to have a conversation, and then others will set the policy. So to me, one of the things that we didn't have early on with coronavirus was what the truth was, what the numbers were. The scientific community wasn't talking and sharing below the level of policy. The national security community didn't have quite the same network to do it below. So I think there is a role for this kind of, what Chris talked about was the non-partisan, non-biased, best assessment of facts on the ground that can be shared internationally. And then policies will be established, but at least the best foundation for whatever happens could be shared. So I think there is a lesson there that might be able to be applied.
Great. Thanks, Sue. General Stewart.
So the challenges of finding tanks, missiles, nuclear sites on our own without international partners is pretty daunting. And here you have an adversary that is not necessarily, is not physically detected, global in nature, irrespective of boundaries. It is absolutely essential to get that collective view by integrating what our partners may be seeing globally. How do you think your way through? What are the requirements? How do you collect and report those requirements? How do you put together those insights? Again, that's the collective view. Because again, going back to an earlier question, the more of these credible, validated reporting, the better insights and the better you can define policy options and informed decision making. So I think if we attempt at all, if we fail to fully integrate our global partners in understanding these types of virus, and particularly how they may be weaponized, we will definitely have some blind spots that will not be helpful in national security and policy making. So critically important to identify those partners with the right strengths and capabilities and access, and leverage the heck out of them to get the insights we need.
Great, thank you. Chris, I didn't know if you want to chime in on this, or everybody's allowed to wave off. Okay, go ahead.
I dissociate myself with all of those remarks and just add one thing further, which is it's not just about the geography or the quantity of insights that we can get from our international partners. Sometimes based upon an experience that we do not have, a life's experience or perspective that they enjoy, they can tell us things about facts that we can observe in common that we would never have imagined. And I have been pleasantly surprised time and again by an international partner who said, I'm looking at the same data you are, but I come to a fundamentally different conclusion about what it portends, largely because you can only explain it through the lens of their experience, which is different and unique than ours. And without that, we're deaf, dumb, and blind.
Excellent. So I'm going to start transitioning to a a long list of questions that have started coming in from our audience. I'm getting some as text, some are from Facebook, some are being posted in WebEx. And sometimes I'm interpreting these, so I apologize. But so I've got one question that begins, got bonuses off our discussion of transparency and sharing, more sharing of more knowledge and resulting in more awareness. But in the world of COVID-19, we're talking about operating at a local level. And we've kind of glossed over a lot of that, right? We talked about it, but I don't know that we have a direct analogy from the intelligence community, but maybe, just from a creative thinking perspective, if we're going to shift our collective security discussion to deal with COVID-19, we have to build trust at a local level with people that are going to use this data, people that are going to collect this data for us, people that are going to, in effect, surrender data, knowing that it's going to go out into this much bigger information environment, not necessarily fully comprehending who's going to get access to it, et cetera. And when it's health, their experience is HIPAA, right? I tell my doctor doesn't tell anybody. But now my location data will actually, betray the fact that I walked into an AIDS clinic, even though the AIDS clinic can't ever surrender my health record, right? So there's all this information at a local level, and we need to build trust at that local level. Do you have any advice on, if we're going to take technology like this and insights with all these uncertainties, how we should think about building trust at a local level? That's a big one. Sue.
So I think you have to really think through the issues of use. We've talked pretty significantly in this conversation about not wanting to escalate the authority of government. Chris talked very eloquently about our lessons. I would say the last 10 years with the NSA in terms of what was intended to be done and what, in hindsight, conversations we should have had. I think the challenge of the world we're in right now is boundaries that we believed in, the difference between that our country was founded on, the distinction between federal and state and local, the distinction between the private sector and the public sector. Now we're trying to find a way to be able to communicate and share information without taking over authority. And so I think this is just hard work that we're going to have to do in terms of, but I would say our lesson is that where there are lots of limitations on how data can be used and lots of effort in terms of how you want to use data before you even go about collecting it. And we're challenged a bit because so much, like I said earlier, isn't being governed a priori by the government. It exists, and then we're trying to put rules on top of it. But between the federal and the state and the local, I think it really is about how do we want it to be used? What good are we going to do? How do we balance the good versus the harm? And then set up constraints that give us the best chance of protecting misuse.
Great. Chris, you had your hand up.
Yeah, just build on that. I think a fundamental question up front is who's being empowered, right? Is it, hey, I want to have a relationship between some central thing, some kind of offstage thing, and some local entity to empower the offstage entity? Or do I want to bring the power and the insight of the offstage thing and empower the locality? I can recall at NSA, we were trying to put together a bigger picture for the men and women who went forward and stood in harm's way, and tactical unit after tactical unit that had local collection apparatus. They could understand what was happening in their environment. Our kind of insight was if we could connect all of those local pictures, we could have one big picture. And as we made the rounds, all of the kind of initial discussions were about, let me have your stuff so that I can build a better big picture. We failed miserably. It wasn't until we said, hey, I want to bring my kind of deficient big picture to your local. I want to give you information, and you will continue to be the arbiter of what you do with that, because the trust was in fact derived locally. So I want to actually empower the local kind of instance of this, and I'm going to bring my big picture to you and let you do what you do, right? That was the winning proposition. So as we think about where trust exists, if it exists at the local level, how do we empower that? How do we infuse that with a bigger insight of the big data that we can bring to bear, as opposed to saying we'll have this paternalistic attitude of give me your data and I'll do the right thing in a place that you've never seen.
Great.
I can't foot stomp that enough. I've been a recipient of bringing the data to the folks in the field, because the perception was they've got some stuff going on back there at Fort Meade that they're just not sharing, and so I got to go dig and fight for it. Having brought the capability now to the front end and having the interaction with the folks on the ground at the local level, did a world of good to know that the SIGINT enterprise was fully supportive of, and I could trust them to share insights that I needed to execute. So unless you get that, in this case, that partnership at the very local level, you cannot, and I use that word carefully, build that level of trust that says, I'm getting everything I need in a timely manner, and it is shaping my decisions, as opposed to someone back there in Washington shaping what's delivered and the decisions I can make.
Great. Thank you for that. So I'm going to go to, does anybody else want to chime in on that? No? Okay. So I've got now I'm reading 3-part questions off of Facebook. So sorry for the awkwardness here. But so we have someone on Facebook kind of keying off of Robert's discussion of false flag information and I guess misinformation that's out there. In the world of geography, we've always enjoyed tremendous benefit from kind of a close partnership between the general public, the people out there collecting information, and the national security community. I mean, maybe not always, but we benefited greatly from it. How do we, as a community of geographers in both realms, government and out in the civil society, indemnify ourselves against malicious or purposefully misleading information from bad actors that's kind of being inserted into our channel? Particularly now that they're able to use our own platforms to create viral information that may be magnified, amplified, and conversely, and that's something General Stewart mentioned. And conversely, how do we protect valid sources from being politicized and hemorrhaging reliability? Because we kind of have that battle right now of disinformation, misinformation, somehow eroding the credibility of that which we know to be true. How do you think we can deal with that challenge, or are there any lessons from the national security community? Robert.
So some of this is new and some of this isn't, right? I mean, for as long as we've been, practicing this craft, we've had to deal with veracity, reliability, misuse, the false flag piece. So that in some ways is normal. Clearly what is different is the scale, right? The magnitude, the speed with which that now new sources, methods can be introduced, whether we want them or not, into the conversation. So let me give you an example. When the Malaysian airliner was shot down over eastern Ukraine in the summer of 2014, tragedy, obviously for the everyone on board, but the immediate international discussion went to attribution, right? What happened? And we went to work. I was pointing at myself because I was in the community at the time. So the community went to work and did its job. And Chris's team and Vince's team and Sue's team, actually did good work. And I'll just cite the Hague's determination of attribution some years later, which was that Russian equipment was moved across the border from Russia into eastern Ukraine in a time and a place in advance of the launch of the missile that brought down the plane, and attributed that to Russian aligned forces. The problem, but that conclusion that I kind of rattled off was 2 years, maybe 3 years after the event. And if you were aligned with Russian interests that summer, you weren't worried about the 3-year decision or conclusion. You were worried about the 3-minute or 3-day conclusion, because the EU was thinking about sanctions. NATO was thinking about actions it might need to take. The UN was thinking about potential issues. All you really wanted to do was to delay and confuse. And so someone, let's just say someone, introduced into that debate a photograph, right? And who doesn't believe a photograph of a Ukrainian fighter trailing the doomed airliner at some distance with a contrail, leaving the fighter's wings, you know, with the air-to-air missile in flight on its way to its target. Now, it was really pretty simple to identify that as a Photoshop manipulation. Didn't matter. Didn't matter, because you know, U.S. government official could stand behind the podium all day and go, it's a fake. Oh, these, you know, Russian, you know, actors are just trying to undermine, you know, our movement towards truth, to Sue's point. Didn't matter, because we had a credibility issue, or, you know, at the time. Well, of course you are going to say that and whatnot. So what am I trying to say, Chris? I'm trying to say that even without manipulation, right? Verifiable image or you know, unaltered transcript or whatever, humans will come to different locations, outcomes, based upon one, where they started, right? They have a bias, they have a frame of reference, and they'll come to the outcome. My only suggestion to how we deal with this, or in a world that's more chaotic and more noisy, is, quite frankly, to use the noise to our advantage. More and more voices. You mentioned things like, well, you didn't say it, but like OpenStreetMap is a way for the crowd to help us delineate features on the planet, you know, roads and buildings and whatnot. Could somebody enter into OpenStreetMap and put in a bad, you know, vector or feature? Of course they could. But the fact that you got 500 editors, you know, working on that area, or even 5, okay, mitigates the effects of the one. And so I would just say the same thing with respect to the introduction of different sources, that we should use the crowd in that way. I am not a blockchain expert, okay, but I understand the theory of it, and that seems to me to make sense. Financial institutions use many eyes, ears, coding fingers around to protect. And so I would say in this case, more transparent, more inclusive, more open, and actually the safer we are from such those who intend bad outcomes.
Great, thanks, Robert. Does anybody else want to chime in on misinformation versus, you know, it seems to me like, you know, one statement I've heard is, you know, it's super hard to build trust. It takes a lot of time and resources and effort, and it's very easy to erode trust. It takes, you know, one bad action, or, you know, inserting the right misinformation or disinformation at the right time or wrong time. So does anybody else have any experiences or thoughts on that, or should I move on? All right, fair enough. So let's see. I guess that one's also about disinformation. So this is maybe a little more esoteric, but given the technology fabric that's being put in place, what do we collectively need to share in our communities and to our decision makers to raise their conscious awareness of this new fabric? What consequences could come forward if we haven't thought about? The reason I like this question is something I think Sue said earlier, several said earlier, in the past, we had an arcane group of folks that kind of knew the rules. They understood the sources. We went to them every day with the information we had. And now we have a much broader set of decision makers that aren't necessarily steeped in the nature of the information that could be available to them, could be relevant to their decision making. And we're just kind of throwing data and new information at them. Is there some new way of engaging that community in a more collective fashion to make them smarter consumers of this kind of information, COVID-19 and beyond? Sue?
Yeah, I think we've talked about it throughout. I'll put it on three levels. Going back to Robert, and I loved everything Robert said on the last answer. I would just say that if you're someone who is responsible for the collection or the hosting of data, you have an obligation to invest in its security. You do, because it is being used, and so participate in protection of data, not just the collection and the purveying of data. The second is, we've got to become much smarter consumers. I think one of the most exciting things about the last 5 years has been much more honest talk about information that is being manipulated. And we're used to this throughout history, whether it's from Soviet counterintelligence activities or whether it's through madmen on Wall Street trying to influence how we think about things. But I would say we need to put our little critical thinking hats on and not just accept every source as being a valid source. Not every human who says what something means is worthy of being believed about what it means. And not every decision needs to be made absolutely in the instant. We are creating a world that is spinning faster and faster because we're reacting so quickly to things that are just popping up. And so I think I'm going to argue for the return of critical thinking as a craft, about not just accepting information from any source as being true, and for doing some processing on your own. From a policymaker perspective, I do think we need to get back to this big concept of what governments do, and what your obligation is to try and create an environment where the populace and the citizenry can pursue happiness and have a good life and have the ability to operate in a world that is relatively true instead of not manipulated. So get on with the little courses in terms of doing that job of government as well. So the technologists protect your data, be critical thinkers, and the government understand what your function is here. Limit yourself to that, and we'll be all right.
Great. Does anybody else want to bite on that one? Chris?
So I'll bite. I liked what Sue had to say a lot, right? Especially the part about the critical thinking. I think that I was part of a school 20, 30 years ago that believed that the kind of emergence of the internet was going to be a boon for democracies and the death knell for autocracies. It might just be the opposite, right? That kind of left to its own devices, the virality of information flow on the internet is fueled by titillation and affirmation. If you have a bias in the morning, you can affirm it 16 times during the day, and you're in an even darker corner at night. So we have to teach our kids, right, at the earliest possible level, these kind of foundational skills of critical thinking so that they actually triangulate, that they actually come to conclusions based upon common sense and a broad array of data. But that alone, that's a necessary but I think insufficient condition, because there's still going to be life forces in the world that attempt to use the internet or cyberspace writ large to divide, to perhaps kind of isolate, to try to kind of mount a particular agenda that's not necessarily in the interest of the receiver. And so we need life forces that connect, that unify, that kind of talk about the positive aspects of the diversity that is this country, or the diversity that is the kind of the community of nations that might array their assets on some common foundation of values. Technology can help in that regard. We can have technology that essentially does some degree of fact checking or kind of does a better job of attribution, but we can't ignore the fact, I think, that leadership matters as much or more in this collision that is the internet or all these forces and globalization. Leadership matters as much or more as it ever did before. And to ignore that fact, right, is to imagine that we can hitch our star ourselves to the star of technology alone and be taken to some kind of a magnificent place. I don't think that's true. Right? We have to imagine that the life force of leadership, positive leadership, unifying leadership matters a lot.
Great points. And the bookends of positive leadership and actual education and critical thinking amongst to create a populace that looks at that leader's leadership critically, I think is interesting bookends. Does anybody else want to chime in on that, or I have another question in the queue? Okay. So one came in: should or can people have access to their own data and information gathered about them? I mean, all of you, not you personally, but your organizations have been subject to FOIA requests. So, I mean, that people can ask, hey, what's going on a subject? And I guess nobody here has done time at the FBI, but I suspect I'm allowed to FOIA my own FBI file if there is one on me. But in a world of COVID-19, right, you've got every local agency. It might be law enforcement, it might be social services, it could be something at the state level, it could be even at the national level, somehow collecting all this information about me. Should I have a right to see all of it, or what should be the rules around that, or the policies and procedures around that? You guys have any experiences that might inform that question? You don't have to. You can say no. Robert, he opened his mic. Now it's your fault, Robert.
Sure. The answer is yes. Did you want more than that, Chris?
No, I'll take that. I saw everybody nod their head, so we could just leave it yes.
Obviously, well, I'll say obviously, it depends. Let me give an old book reference. There's a book by the author David Brin. It's called The Transparent Society, and it opens with a scenario that David describes two worlds. World one is, oh, by the way, both worlds are crazy, digitally connected. There's sensors all over, we're all being watched, 1984 on steroids, and, whatever. But world one is the government, the government holds all that information. And they do it for protection and privacy and all that, but they keep it all to themselves. So everyone knows, the government knows all, but all of us are kind of at the same exposure level. And then the other world is just the opposite. All the data is commonly available, we're all shared, whatnot. And look, I'm not arguing, I don't think either one of those worlds is one that we would want to live on, but if I had to choose, I would choose the latter. I'd rather have the optionality to deal with that data and to know what it is, et cetera, and try to cabin the consequences, negative consequences of my not wanting that data out there, or not, et cetera. So the other thing I love about that book reference is it's 24 years old. He was doing this in 96, thinking that, oh my goodness, we've got cameras on street corners. He's from Great Britain. So, London, was arguably out there in front with the cameras. But so I think yes. And we need to figure out how to make yes work. Myriad questions you could ask about it, but it must be yes in this panelist's view, Chris.
Great. Anybody else want to jump on that one? Sue?
Yeah, I think it's right. I think all my colleagues would say, if you made us choose between security and privacy, we choose privacy every day of the week and twice on Sundays, because that's the foundation of free and open societies, right? The challenge is, what we see is that isn't. It would be lovely if we could find the balance between the two. And I think that's what Robert's talking about. And so that's, again, when you think about what the limits of use are, what the limits of power are, what the instruments of trust are that get you to that solution. But I think it should be comforting to the audience to know that this group of pretty salty national security and intelligence officers are all adamant about privacy.
Great. Thank you for that. Anybody else want to chime in on that? Chris?
Just one last thought, which is that there are occasions when, it's hard to say I'm going to fall to one side of the line or the other. Let's take an example where a law enforcement organization wants to get a wiretap. This is kind of going back way long in time, but it still happens. Wants to get a wiretap on somebody who perhaps is involved in organized crime or some kind of some event that warrants that, no pun intended. And we typically don't disclose, right, the fact that wiretap is ongoing to the person that is being wiretapped, else they would obscure, hide their kind of ill-gotten gains. Now, that being said, society should never be in a place where every citizen doesn't know that authority exists and that it might be brought to bear. We need to be transparent, absolutely, about what kind of the government would collect, under what purposes it would collect that. And what the remedies are if you think that you've been unfairly kind of targeted by that. So even on those very few and exceptional cases where the government's not willing for some just reason to share the content, it needs to share the fact of.
Great. So we are toward the end of the questions. Well, I've lumped and split quite a few. But I do think it's important, particularly given kind of the moment in time that we have in kind of a post-George Floyd world, where we have kind of a shift in cultural consciousness on kind of who is us, who belongs in the dominant narrative. Those who have been marginalized, getting their viewpoints and their worldviews brought into kind of the mainstream discussion. There's a whole discussion around lived experiences in that pre-George Floyd era, and not that it's necessarily changed, around policing, over policing. What is the boundary? Accountability to whom? Where certain groups have been othered and not necessarily treated with the same norms. A lot of the discussion we've had today has been, we need to create these norms, include everybody, and that's great. But the truth is, we have a kind of an us and a them too often in our society when we apply our formal instruments of government, our instruments of policing, our informational tools. As we're living this kind of right now, do you guys have any words of wisdom to those who are going to have to help us navigate this, where we're including more voices into kind of the dominant consensus, which should change how our government and our corporations actually deal with perhaps some of the more vulnerable segments of our society? Does anybody have any, I don't know, kind of words of wisdom on that?
Okay. I'm such a sucker.
You are, Sue, but thank you for it.
Man, no one. I wish there were a world where we could keep bad from happening, where no one would be offended and no one would commit offense, and that's really hard. It's this weird conundrum of open societies, but no one should be treated as less or made to feel less by their government or the institutions that are put in place to enable the freedoms and the liberties not to control. So I think this is a great time in America where we are seeing the world for what it is. We're seeing the consequence of our actions, because we have so much information, we have a chance to choose who we're going to be, right? And that's what I think we're doing right now. I think information cannot be used disproportionately. And anytime we see it being used disproportionately, we have to make sure that it is used equitably. What's really nice about the location information is that there is a common framework to it. You know, the information we're talking about is one that can actually be helpful because it has less potential to be as misconstrued. But governments have huge responsibility to the citizenry to make sure that the actions it takes are not applied disproportionately to the population. And we're seeing that it has been, and we need to address that. That doesn't mean we don't become a nation of laws. That doesn't mean that we don't have law enforcement. That doesn't mean that governments don't have responsibilities. But it does mean that the government can't be part of using information disproportionately against one. And when we see it's happened, the governments must address that.
Great. General Stewart, I think you're up, and then I'll pass over to Chris after you.
So for me, the advice is pretty straightforward. Live out the words of our Declaration of Independence and the framing language in our Constitution. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, words written by imperfect men, whether they were divinely inspired or just recognized the importance of what they were creating. In that declaration, it talks about justice and domestic tranquility. So easy for me to say, let's start with the Declaration of Independence. Let's live out the words of the Constitution that talks about what we hold as truths, that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Again, whether those words were divinely inspired or just words that some imperfect men put on paper. If we could live out the words of our Constitution and translate that to all of our people, this is not new. George Floyd is not new. We've studied the hell out of this problem. At least 8 different commissions that have studied this problem. Yet we continue to see the same injustice and disproportionate prison sentence, disproportionate violence against certain ethnic groups, and failure to live out the words of our Constitution and apply those in reality at the local level means that we're going to have this conversation again in 12 to 18 months, and we'll study the hell out of it some more, and we'll never get at the underlying conditions that it is all about justice and liberty and pursuit of happiness for all Americans. And I'll stop there before I start preaching a whole lot more.
Well, thank you for that. Chris, I saw your hand up.
I think General Stewart nailed it, so I could listen to more of that. I wouldn't consider that preaching. I think that actually kind of strikes the resonant chords of all of us on the panel. I would simply add to that at the end of the day, information is power. That's old but still true. And there's always been a question within this liberal democracy as to what is the purpose of power. If you Declaration of Independence, it talks about the abuse of power. It talks about the purpose of power in the hands of an individual to pursue, right, whatever they construe as happiness. Therefore, in the Constitution, we talked about the purpose of power given to the government, which was to serve, right? It's therefore constrained and it's kind of given for explicit, express purposes. And so those are still true, right? The government needs to be humble about its aggregation and its use of power and always understand that the purpose of that power is to serve the citizenry. Where it gets complicated, I mean, Robert was exactly right earlier where he said the reason we fear government but not individuals is government can arrest or indict or kind of make your life hell on earth. Where it gets complicated is the private sector is increasingly in possession of data that heretofore was unimaginable, and can use that for purposes that make the lives of individuals more difficult, right? Maybe not hell on earth. It can perhaps not achieve what a government could, but it come close, right? And we need to make sure that the private sector and its aggregation of data and its use of that data doesn't stand in the shoes of government in using that data to the detriment of the people that it would otherwise serve through its private pursuits. That gets complicated in this age where we have so much information about so many things, about people, about individuals, right, that really are the organizing principle of this nation. Thanks.
Thank you. Robert.
What a big question, what a big challenge for all of us. I meander or swing between moments of deep darkness about this topic and despair, and it's too big, and are we big enough to live up to the ideals that Vince reminded us about, and great hope. And I'll try to finish with the latter, but I just got to say that as horrifying as the George Floyd, event was, and as tragic as that is, I'll say this citizen was more, well, in a different way, more horrified by what happened to Christian Cooper in Central Park. And that was the conflict between, the bird watcher and the lady walking her dog, etc. And, when she got on that phone, because she felt aggrieved, she felt threatened, she felt whatever, she took 400 years of power that the government had transferred to her as a white person. And by the way, she wasn't included in that declaration either. Okay. She was not a white male at the time. And then took that power through a few sentences to a 911 operator to threaten, the liberty of Christian Cooper. And to me, it's at least as much of our problem. And again, please don't take anything I'm saying to belittle, the consequence, obviously, horrendous consequence suffered at the end of police abuse, etc. So, Chris, I struggle with this. Yes, Vince, we've studied this to death and we've done little about it. Yes, we've made these statements before and we've not affected change with real estate freedom, which leads to educational opportunity, which leads to jobs opportunity, which leads to income. And, earlier I said that I feel like this pandemic is accelerating history. I think that can be largely a good thing, but if this accelerates the gap that we've already built in, then shame on all of us. So here's my hope. My hope is that, this global conversation we are having will lead not to, just the march and just the, the acclamations or the statements. This is more deeply rooted, and I don't have an answer for it, but I do feel like it feels like we're willing to take on those roots in that history and deal with the systemic, the structural nature, of this challenge, and also know that this is not a COB next Friday. This is an ending journey, which Vince properly recognized. We started nearly 250 years ago. We have never gotten it right or perfect, right? It's always more perfect, but boy, game is on. And so I'm looking forward to locking arms with each of the participants here as we try to deal with that reality.
Great. Well, thank you, Robert. Thank you, panelists. This has been a great journey with you. We have learned so much from your experience as leaders in the national security community. Learning by analogy is kind of core to my life, and I think there's a lot of useful analogies here that we as a society can explore as we try to struggle with the ethical implications of mobile location tech as we weather COVID-19 and beyond, right? I think as we pointed out, this is just the latest in a series of challenges to our safety, security, and well-being. And there will be another one soon. We just don't know what it is. But hopefully, if we keep an organized dialogue and we can be proactive, we can get ahead of ourselves. So thank you, Chris. Thank you, Sue. Thank you, General Stewart. Thank you, Robert, for taking the time to be with us. For those out there on the web listening, we still have more panels to come. We have 3 currently scheduled, one on August 4th on state and local experience with mobile location tech, past, present, and future. Next one on August 6th is around data quality, which we explored a bit today, around false negatives, false positives, but particularly as they relate to policing and surveillance. And then third, on August 7th, is digital contact tracing tools, featuring the lead researchers from the recent Harvard Kennedy School Belfer Center study that Sue was actually a part of. And so we'd love to have you tune in for all of these. As always, these are not only being streamed live, but being archived on the web. We see this as our contribution to the permanent record. So when all of you want to reflect on the big issues around these topics, you've got a digital resource to go to. So if you're not able to make these dates, they will be available on the web. So thank you to our panelists. Thank you to everybody who has tuned in, and thank you to our sponsor at the Henry Luce Foundation for making all of this possible. The Location Tech Task Force has had a busy spring and summer, and we look forward to bringing more insight from great leaders like we've had today to all of you. So thank you everybody, and have a wonderful rest of your summer. Take care. Bye-bye.